as a kind of either as a cautionary tale or as a site of marginalization or exclusion, but also going beyond that and creating
absolutely.
waves of resistance.
Yeah, I want to transition into your article, Radiant Ecologies. You explore how like photography grapples with nuclear violence in Chernobyl and Fukushima. And what drew you to these sites? And does your positionality in South Asia offer a different lens on how these ecologies of harm, and what drew you to sort of looking at these landscapes?
I suppose it does, right? I mean, I have not consciously thought about this because I have not used any South Asian scholarship
Mhm.
to interrogate these spaces. So, but I assume that one's positionality does end up informing one's critical lens. So, I mean, there are two things that. So, one was I was kind of because this was written as a paper for a conference on animals in war and disaster. So that was the impetus for this. And again, I wanted to kind of look at non-spectacular forms of disaster, pervasive. So disaster that just doesn't end with that event, but a new way of thinking of the event itself as beyond the non-apocalyptic as something that permeates and sort of continues in these incremental or slow forms. And that was fun because I was looking at nuclear waste and how radioactive waste operates. So I'm kind of trying to draw a parallel between radioactivity's own visual style, and it sort of has this kind of it allows us to approach the invisible in a particular manner, and photography as a medium. But I think primarily where my position I think matters is in my resistance or my wariness to see these sites as utopian spaces where the human has been replaced by the non-human, or sites where which have kind of in a way escaped. So again, this attempt to whitewash the damages of radioactivity and say that, well, okay, lives were lost and sort of and there was an enormous cost of these explosions and sort of the nuclear waste coming into these spaces, but eventually these have become spaces of rewilding. There's the non-human has taken over, and we can think of these as kind of resorts almost, or the breeding of these spaces. Now that is a narrative that I do not buy, and I feel that so much of media and so much of photography, Daman Richter, for instance, have projected Chernobyl, not so much Fukushima, but Chernobyl as these almost fantasy spaces, these utopian spaces of greening. But greening at the cost of what? Because again, that whole narrative of greening, my fears, I'm very afraid, I suppose, of historical erasure and amnesia. The celebration of greening should not come at the cost of forgetting the dangers of nuclear energy, if not monitored or if not critically approached. So that's where I think the whole biopolitics part of it comes. That I'm sort of looking at studies which are now coming up. These are recent studies which have see that it's not as if the animals have not escaped mutation, or that there is this entire forest of, I think these were pine trees or redwood. I'm forgetting the actual species, which were destroyed by radiation mutation. There are instances of mutation. It's a sort of the lives of, and there's this essay by Jonathan Turnbull that looks at the dogs of Chernobyl. These are feral animals, and to say that they are living in some kind of a utopian space would be a form of would be reductionist, and also erasing certain histories. So I kind of want to approach this whole idea of, or this whole narrative of rewilding through the lens of harm and injury caused by radiation. So I suppose that is where my position sort of comes in. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, that was excellent. I think this brings me to the concept of visual in nuclear photography, the spectral realm of what cannot be seen, and how does that reshape our ethical responsibilities as witnesses to nuclear harm?
Thank you so much for that question. So with the nuclear, there are two. We're looking at kind of two problem areas. One is the difficulty of comprehending it. And in that sense, it is a hyper object. So the difficulty of comprehending it, the difficulty of registering it as a harm even, as a kind of danger even. But the other is that the nuclear itself has been part of a visual discourse. And I explore a little bit of that at the beginning of the article, that it's sort of opened specifically because of its kind of ontological character, its spectral character. It sort of became this space of fascination for thinking about mutation or monsters, so radioactive monsters. It kind of led to a whole speculative genre where again it was also part of the atomic race, where the whole point was to glorify nuclear energy, even though it is invisible or it's something that we cannot conceptualize. The very sort of unrepresentability of it adds to the nuclear being uh, this kind of utopian intervention, or this technology that sort of answers all our energy problems. Also, as an emblem of unchallenged power. So there is also, in that sense, the problem of misrepresentation and the kind of nuclear conscious or nuclear visuality. I look at the idea of nuclear unconscious. There is also a nuclear conscious or a nuclear, a kind of dominant visuality that gets formed around nuclear power, with early films like Godzilla, or even this kind of this understanding that nuclear energy itself works like a photographic process. But my interest in the nuclear is primarily sort of taking this idea of the invisible and looking at invisibilized lives. So I am interested in animals because we don't talk about, there's hardly any literature or even journalistic work on the animal survivors of nuclear disasters. We only think of,
Yeah.
and we know this now, that in Chernobyl, the dogs were left behind. That the people were instructed to leave their dogs behind for the fear of the dogs being vectors of contamination. And then they were culled eventually. And some of them managed to escape, and the present dogs are in fact the descendants of the early, the dogs that managed to escape that culling. So I mean, and so can we think of nuclear disasters as forms of ecocide? And so my interest is in sort of looking at the invisible also in that register. That how can we extrapolate the idea of the nuclear as invisible, as sort of allowing us to think about the invisible, and to acknowledge the invisible and politicize it and kind of look at invisible lives or invisibilized lives. And these are lives that are, again, directly affected by the nuclear, by the sort of the fallout, or by the flip side of nuclear energy. And the three photographers that I chose, and two primarily, Ritika and Oldham, I sort of felt that there is an attempt to engage with the invisibility of these lives, the invisibilization of these lives, while recognizing them as radiated subjects, irradiated subjects, radioactive subjects. And so again, also allowed me to go back to biopolitics, go back to this whole idea of the disposable life, the life that we want to kind of wash our hands off, either because they don't matter, or in this case, because they are polluted. And they become emblems of that pollution. And there are various categories of kind of referring to that pollution, either as feral or wild or excessive or mutant. But ultimately, it boils down to Zoe, to bear life that is not to be included in the idea of a qualified life, or a life worth saving and defending. So, photography then, as kind of providing a kind of visibility, but a very critical visibility, a politicized visibility.
Yeah.
Right? So, where, it is actually the invisibilization that is being visibilized. So, there is this very poignant photograph by Paromita of this cattle farm this is in Fukushima, where you have these cows that have been left behind. And the photograph is of this emaciated cow looking at the skeleton of a companion that has died. And it's sort of, the shot is a low angle shot. So it's kind of making us see the damage that has happened to the land, the earth itself, while taking us through. So it's guiding the eye from the surface of the earth through the skeletal remains to that emaciated. That's the kind of work that I'm interested in. It's a certain visibilization of invisible, which also reminds us of the kind of ideological operations of invisibilization itself. But invisibilization itself comes from that there is a certain violence that is kind of premeditated violence. that causes invisibility, and how the nuclear then participate.
Bringing in Anna Singh's art of noticing into conversation with your work, do you see? I think this theme resonates through a lot of what you're trying to do, which is this practice of noticing. How might it help to notice forms of life that are otherwise erased or often overlooked by dominant narratives?
It's also, I mean, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit and expand it. It's not, I mean, I think what is at stake here, not just recognizing, acknowledging, finding new ways of articulating, documenting these lives that fall outside of the biopolitical paradigm, lives that sort of become resource for extraction, or lives that are sort of immaterial in many. But it is also what it does to the view. The kind of questions it raises for the position of the visual subject, the viewing subject. That's where I think, for me, that is the pertinent question, because it reminds us of the limits of representation itself. It reminds us of the historical location, how we see that, seeing is not this default, vision is not a default capacity that we have, that it originates from certain discursive and political position. So it allows us to recognize that, and then allows us to, it tells us something about the epistemology of vision itself, that it operates from within certain meaning systems or within certain dominant knowledge. And in that, they also come with certain limitations.
Yeah.
And what it then does, it does to unravel the structure of the anthropocentric subject, how it kind of shows us, it's sort of in a way that, we are entangled, we are responsible, we need to become critical of our choices, presumption, our sort of position in the world. So it kind of, I think, for me, that is, I mean, I'm obviously interested in the kind of possibilities arts of noticing open up for lives that are, sort of, that liminal lives, or lives that occupy that constitutive outside. But what does it do to the constitutive inside? What does it do to the privileged sub? How does it change our